A number of years ago, when I was living in Cincinnati, or north of Cincinnati, a favorite spot of mine to go relax, perhaps do a little study, was the Barnes & Noble bookstore. And I'd get coffee and sit and read, or I'd peruse the shelves and stack up a bunch of books I could never afford to buy, and then I'd read them and then I'd put them back, or just leave in the pile for the people who worked there to put back. But you know, Barnes & Noble and Borders, they have these discount shelves. I saw this one day on the discount shelf, and it caught my eye because it's huge. It actually had a cardboard dust jacket on the outside of this that I can't find anymore. I probably should have preserved it though. But it was white, and it had a picture of Jesus, as I recall, sitting on Mary's lap. So it was a lovely painting from the Vatican. If you can't see this, it says the Holy Bible with illustrations from the Vatican Library. And I thought, well, that is an impressive volume. And I picked it up and I turned it on the back, and it said that the list price was $495. And I thought, well, man, I mean, it's heavy, but that's a lot of money. But it was discounted 90%. And I thought, well, for $49.50, I could probably pull it up. So I bought it. It's silk out here and silk on the binding, and when you open it up, it's silk in here too. This is 14 karat gold on the edges, and on the inside are lovely illustrations like this. The printing is really spectacular. It has the classic sort of family record of marriages and births, and there should be deaths. Oh, baptisms, sorry. Confirmations, for those of you who do that sort of thing. There are the deaths. Hopefully it goes in that order, right? Well, family tree. Both sides of the family. Then we get to the Holy Bible with illustrations from the Vatican Library. And all of these pictures come out of manuscripts or images that are held at the Vatican Library. So Genesis 1 is quite impressive. You can see this. You'll have a chance to come look at these later. This beautiful picture of the 6 days of creation. You can get a less expensive economy version of this Bible. It doesn't have the silk, doesn't have the gold and the ink, and it's a mere, I don't know, $80 or something. You can actually score this one now for about $100 on Amazon. There are a few used ones out there. Even the new ones have come down to about $350. I haven't seen one for $49.50. This reminded me of a book that I had when I was growing up. It sat, I didn't have it, my mom and dad still have it. It sat in our dining room on a hut, on a slanted, little stand. And we just called it the Family Bible. We never opened it. We never looked at it. I mean, on occasion my mom would turn to a picture that was seasonally appropriate. But we didn't use it. It really just sat there, sort of a presence in the room. Well, this reminded me of that. But here it is. This is a nice heirloom in the making, right? It's got all the right qualities, all the right features. It's gold on the outside, silk here, these beautiful pictures. But it's not the King James. It's actually the NRSV, which is a pretty interesting juxtaposition. And so I call it the Turner NRSV. And I call it the Turner NRSV because the impetus behind this is a guy named Turner. Now, can you name a famous Turner?
Ted Turner.
Ted Turner got his noggin together, that he got it in his head. He wanted to do something like this, and he worked with Oxford University Press to produce this thing. Now, I've never heard it called it Turner. I never even heard it referred to. But I love the idea behind it. What it's doing is putting the Bible, the biblical text, which is, in many ways central to our culture, wrapping it in a form that goes back quite a ways. It reminded me certainly of my childhood. It made me think of things that families passed on from one generation to another. But it's a very modern approach. The printing is modern. The paper is thick and acid-free, and the process by which it's printed is high quality, and the text that it's using is just a couple of decades old. So it's not the King James, So it has the appearance of something that is it's like a term paper printed with an old English font. It has the appearance of something old, serious, and yet it has all the conveniences or the features of something very modern. So that began me thinking years ago about the funny way we sometimes package Bibles. And I know sometimes in your classes you'll have illustrations of Bibles that are packaged in funny ways. I just saw on Dr. Ramey's filing cabinet the Revolve Bible, which is that sort of magazine New Testament for teenage girls. It's a really funny sort of packaging, and we could go on and on forever about the way the Bible is packaged. What I want to talk about today, though, are a couple of interesting texts that we have here on campus that don't necessarily represent the packaging enterprise so much of the Bible, but the ways in which the Bible itself can be presented and preserved, and what that says about the communities that present and preserve, and the way these approaches to preservation sort of have ironic relationships. So that's why this is the juxtaposition of the Messiah College Torah Scroll and the Codex Sinaiticus. So I'm going to start off with a little, what I'll call a text primer, just some information for you if you're not very familiar with the way Old Testament and New Testament scholars think about texts. A text is anything that's written nowadays. It's anything that's perhaps acted or thought or seen, but we're thinking particularly of things that are written down in history. One of the oldest, perhaps the oldest significant piece of the Bible is this. This is actually the photograph on the left and the drawing of it on the right. It is one of two silver scrolls found in a burial site called Ketef Hinnom in Jerusalem. It's dated to the 6th century before Jesus. So this is a fairly old, they're very small. They were both rolled up and perhaps hid inside some sort of an amulet. This has been unrolled, and the scribing was done on silver with a very, very sharp stylus. And what it contains is actually a portion of the priestly blessing out of Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 to 26. And which is, may the Lord bless you and keep you, may the Lord make his face shine upon you and give you peace. So this is one example of an ancient text that is in our Bible. Now it's an odd example because it's not representative of a large body of text. This isn't an old Bible. This is an old fragment of a text that is in our Bible. And I don't even know enough about the scholarship on this to tell you whether or not that text is believed to have been in circulation before. Was this on the scroll because it was in the Bible? Or is it in the Bible because it was popular enough to be on the scroll and in the Bible? So there's a relationship there that I'm not all that clear on. But this is an early example of a text. Something outside of what we might consider a Bible today, but bears witness to biblical language in the ancient world. This is an example of a text called the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a collection of texts that were found in a series of caves in the Qumran Desert. And this is from Cave 4, which had the biggest repository of caves. It's in Paleo-Hebrew, which is an older form of Hebrew writing. It's part of the book of Exodus. And the reason I have this up here, then this would date from sometime, a few centuries before Jesus, or probably 1 or 2 centuries before Jesus. See the stitching? It's actually on animal skin, and this is a line of stitching. When I was young, I used to laugh at professors whose hands would do this. And now my own hand does that. Divine payback. Of course, it gets worse if you do it at this angle. It's exacerbating my shape. And we'll see other examples of this, but it's a great demonstration of how you can see, bear witness to the production of the text, right? So this is an important, bears witness to an early text. It's part of the book of Exodus, and a couple thousand years old. This is another Dead Sea Scrolls text from the same cave. This is actually part of the book of Psalms. Slightly different text, Hebrew script. You can see this is not Paleo-Hebrew. This is much closer to what we call standard Hebrew. And another example from the book of Psalms. This is out of the 11th cave of Qumran, but this is Psalm
119. Does anybody want to impress us all by saying what's special about Psalm 119? It's the largest psalm, longest psalm. Formally, what's up with that psalm? Good, Jeremy.
It's the middle of the Bible, isn't it?
Depends on which Bible.
It's like divided up into like 8 verse sections
Yep.
with like a title that's like a letter of the Hebrew alphabet or.
Yeah, good, except for the title. But every letter of the Hebrew alphabet is given its own sort of 8-line stanza. And so you can see that actually here, each of these lines begins with a kaz. Each of these lines begins with a lamed, each of these begins with a nun, and here's a sam. So each of so you can see it very clearly. Now there's something else though that's really fascinating about this. This is a very complicated, what we call an acrostic psalm. See this? And here, it looks a little different. You want to take a guess? This is the Tetragrammaton. This is God's name. Now, this is what gets translated into our Bibles as the Lord in all capitals. Oftentimes I'll say Yahweh. It's a good guess of how it was pronounced. But here we have a scroll that's a couple thousand years old that is demonstrating a certain reverence for God's name, but it's demonstrating that reverence by setting it in a different style of letter. This is an old Paleo-Hebrew script. It shows us that even 2,000 years ago there was something very special about God's name. They were treating it differently even when they would write the name down. And there's some evidence that the scribes at Qumran, when they would get to that name, would put down their stylus and they'd go and wash their hands and come back and write the name and then they'd go wash their hands and come back and keep writing. Very careful about the writing of God's name. And the reason I show you this is to demonstrate that there's an interest, even in the ancient world, at how things are presented. This is sort of the old English font version, way back then. And scholars use this, again, it bears witness to an ancient text, and scholars will use this and look at other texts and try and determine what is the most accurate text that we have of the Hebrew Bible or of the Bible in general. This is another Dead Sea Scroll out of Jeremiah, and what I love about this one is that you see a stitching line. Well, actually, I think I have a bigger picture of it here. Right there. Now, I don't know, Emerson, you might be able to help me with this, or Meg, or Eric. Is that a repair, or is it originally in the text itself? I can't tell. Emerson's not talking with it. Right. But the reason I show it again is to demonstrate this, the way of production, that they're using this animal skin, carefully preserving it, carefully producing it so that it can be used. Now, this is a much, much larger text. This is the most famous text out of the Qumran caves. This is the famous Isaiah scroll. It's the best preserved. It's the complete book of Isaiah. It has its own sort of museum now in Jerusalem. Anybody been? Yeah, you have the scroll of the book, and the shrine of the book. And you can go in and the whole thing is just unrolled for you there. You see the stitching down the side here. It's in beautiful shape. And I'll come back to this and remember this picture. We'll come back to this particular example in a little bit. So that gives you a sense for what's out there in the ancient world, what we're dealing with when we talk about doing textual criticism and trying to get take a look at what's available for us to see. We don't have complete Bibles that go back that far. We're just dealing with bits and pieces of things. And when we come forward, we have to, leap quite a ways forward actually to get to something that we would consider to be complete. And our first example of that is what is known as the Codex Sinaiticus. Now, the Codex Sinaiticus is a book that was named for the Sinai Peninsula. It's actually, it was discovered or rediscovered at a monastery in Sinai called St. Catherine's. The discovery of this has I don't know, I started to, we could make a movie of this. It would be sort of a combination of Indiana Jones and the Da Vinci Code. Tom Hanks, we're doing this. It was sort of found by a guy named Tischendorf in the 18th century, early 19th century, and there ensued an effort to get the thing out of the monastery library where it was held into European hands. So it's named, it actually, parts of it ended up in, no, wait, sorry. That's not the text I'm talking about. My bad. The Codex Sinaiticus, hang on a second. No, it was. This is the Tischendorf text, right? Yeah. When he first saw it, he got out of there with something like 43 sheaves of it. It's a book, it's a codex, so it's bound like we would expect a modern text to be bound. It's an early example of a book. He gets out of there with 43 some pages of it and attempts to go back and get some more, and he eventually, it's a complicated story, but he eventually gets the monastery to lend it to him so that he can take it back to Europe and do a full evaluation of it, a full study of it, and it actually never ends up going back to Sinai. There's 10 years later, a word that no, they actually promised to give it to us, and then they sold it, and the British Museum actually put up about £100,000 for it at one point. It ended up in Britain, and then it ends up back in the Soviet Union. I mean, it's just the bizarrest sort of trail of. The reason I'm giving you this sort of background is because it ended up, make a long story short, we ended up with this, which is, I think, maybe the largest book in our library. And it now serves as a witness to more than just its original purpose. It is the oldest complete, and complete is qualified, it's nearly complete, example of the Bible. Now it's in, I'll show you more pictures of this. This is all pictures on beautiful heavy paper. And it's in Greek. It's the New Testament, it's the Old Testament, several texts from what we would call the Apocrypha. And most of it was, when Tischendorf found it, all in one piece. There were some fragments that were found later. There were pieces that were found that had actually been used as parts of bindings for other books later. And after the monastery had sort of lost the thing for good, they eventually rediscovered or discovered some other examples of the text, and they held on to those. They now have about 18 pages of it that they've kept. But it's an example of a Greek text that is arguably the oldest significant text in the example of the Bible. Perhaps the oldest significant text, or single book in the world. You can come and take a look at that later. You can access it here in the library, but you can also do something rather remarkable. If you visit the online site, you can find the entire thing here. And if I want to look at a particular passage, pull up John. You know where I'm going? I figure you'll be able to read this one. All right. So it's taken to me to the page wherein I might find John 3:16. Now, let's slide this up. Now, if I don't know how to read that, I'm at something of a loss to actually find John 3:16 there. But if I go over here, oops, there it is. You can't quite see the screen, the shape of the screen. If I find a particular verse here, I can click on it and it will show me where on the larger folio piece it is. So right here, John 3:16 begins. And if I click on that word, is that astonishing? Must be because the screen is in a different size. Let me see if I can fix that. Is it technology? Is it God's revenge? Okay, there it is. So 16 begins here. The word just continues on to the next. I can zoom in without losing the. See how the text doesn't have any word breaks in it. The photography is, to say the least, astonishing, right? You look how close we're getting. And the technology allows me to highlight the actual word in the transcription, and it pops up here in the original text. And what we have is the capacity then to do actually some text critical work. There's a little sign here. Any Greek students in here that can tell me what that means? It's a little T. Means that something is missing from the text that we would expect to be there. And if I click on this, I think it should show me. Maybe it doesn't. You look over here, see this? So this word has been written in between the lines. The Sinaiticus has been corrected and edited more than any other ancient text. It's a great example of how the Bible has not exactly static, as people have looked at it and over the years, it doesn't get corrected anymore, but for 400 or 500 years, it was in a process of being continually adjusted. There are several different hands involved in creating it, and this is the word his inserted in here. So that God doesn't give a son, God gives his only begotten son. But there's something else missing here. You can't see it on the screen, but it's actually the verb he gave is missing from the Codex Sinaiticus. For God so loved the world that his only begotten son, so that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Other texts tell us that you need a verb in there. He gave. And that's what's missing. So the editors of this particular online version have done us an amazing service by showing us what is missing from most of what we consider to be the authentic text.
Brian?
Yep.
While you're there, can you just say a quick word about the,
This?
you were talking about the Tetragrammaton in the Greek.
Oh, yeah.
The Theos and then the Theon too.
Yeah, this here, see the line above here is actually, you can see the picture of it here. This is an abbreviation of Theos. So God's name is, well, the word God is abbreviated. Like, what do we call this a, it's not a,
Soccer.
yeah, well, but it's actually I'm thinking of like a linguistic term for a sign or like a, that's okay, it'll come to me later. So there's this one, and then, this one here, Huigon, which is son. So the holy name is abbreviated. It probably does have to do with the sacred nature of those words. They are. We don't write them all the way out. And then let us know, right? What's there? Here it is in the transcription, and there you can see it in the text itself. So this comes from the mid-4th century, 350, which is what, 1650 some years ago, 1660 years ago. Made on parchment, it's bound in book form, not bound anymore, but bound in book form. You have this astonishingly wonderful, online capacity with it. But what interests me is not the original, actually, today. I mean, I'm very interested in the original. I think it's great. But what interests me most for today is this. this thing, this 35-pound doozy that we paid a fair bit of money for. Somebody spent a lot of time taking beautiful pictures of. Right? It's now, it doesn't have a bookmark, it doesn't have a page to record baptisms and births and marriages or birth of family. But there's something about our interest in the ancient text that has led us to create this thing. There's even a little lip in here that supports the pages when you slide it into the box. It's just, right? So my question then, how does this sort of illustrate some of the same idiosyncrasies that lead to something like this? Okay, so those are the kinds of questions of, think about the communities that first produce a text like this. Greek reading, probably to some extent Greek speaking. It's not the Hebrew Old Testament, it's the Greek translation. So even though it's 300, or it's from 350, it's the Christian Bible that was probably most popular. The Septuagint seemed to be the dominant Old Testament text for the early Christian community, and that's what we have here. And things like the Shepherd of Hermas is in here, and the 1st and 4th Maccabees. So there's a number of apocryphal texts that the early church was using. So it's very, but I love the fact that we have the original language of the Greek, and yet the Old Testament is a translation. So even though we're going that far back, beyond, as you'll see in a minute, any complete Hebrew Bible that we have, far beyond any complete Hebrew Bible, it's in the Greek. It's not in the Hebrew. So there's some really strange sort of juxtaposition just in this collection alone. All right, so that's the Codex Sinaiticus. We'll come back briefly to that in a minute. Well, I mentioned the original community. Think about this community, the community that bought it. Now this thing lives in this community. That boxed publication wasn't done for the ancients, it's done for us. I don't speak Greek, I barely read it. But there's something about that text that made me call our library liaison and say, go ahead, Mike, buy it. It was actually Emerson Power who told me to go. No, it's Mike Power. No, I'll get my friends in trouble. All right, so that's the Codex Sinaiticus, and we will come back to that. So the Codex Leningradensys now. This is not part of my original idea for the presentation, but it sort of lent itself to the same thing, because what we have here, about 10 years before the Sinaiticus came out, this is 1998, I think, is when this was first published. This is the oldest complete Hebrew Bible. And it is a book in the ancient world. It's also a photographic reproduction in the modern world. So it has a lot in common with the Sinaiticus. It's called the Codex Leningradensis because it is housed in Leningrad. Okay. It was produced probably in Cairo. It's also done on parchment. It was produced in 1008 or 1009 AD. So it's a full 650 some years after the original behind the Codex Sinaiticus. Is it online? I wish. It is online in the following way. It is a very large PDF. I'm not kidding. You can download the entire thing as a PDF. This is the cover. That's the original cover. Right? Looks nice. Doesn't it remind you of that big old family Bible sitting in the living room? I mean, there's some great overtones that these, beautiful worked leather and the brass, edges that almost look like they could be hinges, right? It's gorgeous. And then on the inside, it looks. There are a few of those magnificently colored pages, and they've taken a few of those and transposed them. Those are called carpet pages, and I'll talk about those in a moment. That's not biblical text. Well, it's verses, but this is most of what the text looks like. And it's how big is that thing? I downloaded it yesterday. It's on my computer now. It's something like 750 meg. It's a big PDF. So, but it's pretty cumbersome. I mean, you look at that Greek site. That's slick. You can't do that with this. I don't know if there's a project in the works that would help us get to that, It would be nice, right? Ironically, this is not the same text, but this is a few hundred years earlier than this. This is called the Aleppo Codex. And it used to be the oldest complete Hebrew Bible. It was kept in Syria in a synagogue, and when Israel was declared a state in 1948, there were riots in Syria, the synagogue burnt down, and we lost the Torah off of this one. Thought they lost the whole book for a while, but then it turned up sometime later. And I think there's a bit of Deuteronomy left, but we've since lost Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and almost all of Deuteronomy. But the Aleppo Codex, there used to be, is probably produced in the same tradition as this, and may have been been produced in the same region. But the Aleppo Codex has some, shall we say, loyalists, and they have produced this. So just there we go. So here's the Aleppo Codex. Maybe I should have you help me with my screen. Hang on. There we go. Nope, still not letting me do it. Well, I can show you at least from here. So introduction about the text. You'll be able to get, there it is. Oh, you can do with this almost what you can do with the Greek one. You can scroll over a word, it will highlight the word, and it will even translate it for you right there. It's astonishing. And it's not for the whole Bible. It's not even for the whole Old Testament. Right? The Aleppo Codex, no, the Aleppo Codex does have the entirety of the Old Testament for us, except for the Pentateuch, as I mentioned. It's missing. So that's an impressive document, and it's very helpful. It gives us something of what this could be eventually, right? Do you remember the Dead Sea Scroll text that I showed you? I'll get back to my PowerPoint here. Oops. This is the old Isaiah scroll, the great Isaiah scroll from the Mount Gunshai that this is going to be. This is what it looks like in full, and if you click on this baby, you can highlight particular verses. And again, this is very old, over 2,000 years old, and you can see textual work being done here as well. You can zoom in very easily. I can get right down to the pores in the sheepskin. And Meg, you've seen this. How big is the writing? It's not large. It's a very, very tiny script. So my hope is that eventually, somebody will have the commitment to do with this what they've done with this. Right? I mean, maybe that we have the Aleppo, we don't need it with this, but to have this only available as a PDF is a little bit disheartening. But in many ways it parallels the Sinaiticus, but it still has some quirky features about it that I'll talk about in a little bit.
Is that in pointed or unpointed Hebrew?
It's pointed. It's rare, in fact, that the pointing seems to have been done by the same hand that did the consonants. They were often handed off, but it seems to have been done by the same hand. And now what you really all come for. The Messiah Scroll. We don't have a name for this thing yet. This is not the Messiah Scroll. This is what, this makes, the more I think about this, the angrier I get. I should ask the camera to be turned off. The history behind the Messiah Scroll is that in about 2004, I got a phone call from Old Main, I'll just lump the whole thing together there. Said, that we have a donor who's interested in giving us a scroll, a Torah scroll. Do we have any interest in that? And I said, well, yeah. So I quick sent an email about what we could do with it, how it would be educationally helpful for us. I had Gordon Brubaker, another faculty member here at the time, did the same kind of thing, and we waited. We waited. I had seen the appraiser's report. I knew that it was 300 years old. I knew that it was from a Jewish community in Morocco. I knew a lot about it. I knew how much they were appraising it at, and I waited. The idea was the family, well, there they are. Melvin Eister and his wife Vivian, lovely people, who wanted to give this to us. They wanted to lend it to us for a year for tax purposes, and then give it to us completely. And Old Main said, well, we don't think we want to bother. So that there is the chair of the Biblical and Religious Studies Department, or their version of it, Bible ministry, I think, at Heston College in, where, Kansas?
Heston,
Where? Where is it, Kansas?
Heston, Kansas.
It's in Heston, all right, it's north of, Wichita, yeah. Lovingly displayed for all to see. This is an article out of the Mennonite Weekly Review from 2005, where they had it lovely ensconced. And there it was. So a year later, when I got another phone call from a different Old Main, and they said, we have a donor who has a Torah scroll. Are we interested in it? I took my time. I wrote a very careful letter. I got more support, and I said yes. And we got the Messiah scroll. So it arrived in 2006, it became officially ours in 2007, and this is it. It doesn't come from Morocco. It comes from what we believe to have been a Jewish scriptorium in southern Russia from the second half of the 19th century. So just for your own sake of imagining this, 1875. We don't know the story behind the scroll. It's a Torah scroll, so it's not the whole Old Testament. It's just Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But this is the scroll that would have been in an ark, in a special case up on the bimah in a synagogue. And it would have been used weekly and for reading the lessons during worship. And I wish we knew the story of how it came to be, out of Russia. The Soviet pogroms of the first half, actually the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century devastated the Jews in southern Russia. And it's quite possible that some of the people who fled took it with them. We just don't know. The Eisters got a phone call from their investment banker in Atlanta and said, we've got some investment opportunities, are you interested? And that's how they came to have access to these scrolls. And I believe Mr. Eister is a graduate of Messiah College. His wife Vivian is a graduate of Heston. That's why they gave the one to Heston. It is a terrific educational tool for us. But I also want to point out some of the strange juxtapositions that I pointed out with the earlier things. When it's sitting in its hiding place, it's wrapped up in this. This binds the two scrolls together. This is brand spanking new velour, right? The color's beautiful. The wood is gorgeous. It matches the rolling set, which is brand spanking new too, at least compared with the scroll. So the scroll is, if you will, bound or rebound with a different cover than it originally had. So it bears some of the same sort of curiosities in terms of presentation that those other texts that we've already talked about. It even is the same color as the Turner NRSV. Must be something about burgundy. It's not silk, it's velour. Sheepskin, as were the Leningradensis Codex and the Sinaiticus Codex. 200 columns, handwritten. The original community would have been, we presume, Jews in Russia, at least the rabbi and several others in the community would have been able to read the Hebrew. Boys would have been able to read the Hebrew at least until they got through the bar mitzvah. I don't know how much they remembered after that. But we are in many ways the secondary community of this. we are, you know, some of us Hebrew reading, some of us not, but we're Christians and we're in Grantham, and we actually know very little about the gap between us and this. But whereas the other texts up here are pictures of the ancients, produced for a very particular audience now. This is not a picture. This is the real deal. But it's a lot younger than what these are photographs of, and yet it preserves a way of writing the gospel, and the idea of the scroll is much older than the codex. So you see that the scroll is a form that is earlier than the codex, which is actually so much. So this is the modern scroll in the ancient book. I mean, these look like modern books. They preserve an ancient book with all of the technology available to us. This is an intentionally ancient method in the modern world. It's 130 years old, but relatively speaking, it's from the modern world. So that's the irony of these things being in one place at the same time, right? So the way the communities have valued the text and the different ways in which those values have manifested the text, have produced the text. The Sinaiticus bears witness to a much older text, and yet the Sinaiticus was a translation, the Old Testament was a translation from a Hebrew text. This would have been, you know, you could imagine this being a copy of something that, you know, obviously comes much later, but nonetheless is the same idea. So that's, as we think about the way these things are preserved and what they say about the communities that, you know, have put the investment behind them, we end up with some strange similarities in spite of the differences. So I've gone on for a long time. I'd be happy to entertain some questions and then give you guys a chance to come up and look all you like. I only ask that when you come up to the scroll, you not touch it. Oils from your skin can do some damage to the parchment. But before I let you have at it, any questions or observations about these things, these texts? Yes?
I was going to say, just one additional comment about the tetrahedron.
Yep.
The pointing system was around by the Masoretes.
Yep.
And what they pointed was the letters or the vowels for Adonai, because the Jews do not read that word. They're afraid they would take the name of God in vain.
Right.
And so it wasn't until it got into the Greek and the translation of that the Greek letters appeared that it would pronounce Yahweh, as you said.
Yeah. Well, and Jehovah is actually a sort of a butchering of.
My Haiti professor always had a good laugh over that.
Yeah, I mean, this is what the Hebrew looks like. When you see God's name, it would look something like that. But the vowels that they sprinkle around it are for another word, and many of you have heard this before. But if you're German and you see that, you write a J, and then there's the H, and this is the W or the V, and then there's the other H, and you're reading this way. And so the E and the, I don't know which way to write the E now, go backward and forward. E, how do I make it, there you go. I really forgot. And then there's an O and there's an A. The word, my Lord, or Lord Adonai is what they would pronounce instead of this. I actually just saw a paper last night, I read half of it, where there's some scholarship now that thinks actually that the O vowel is missing a lot of times from the Tetragrammaton, the writing of it. And so what you end up with is something like, it could be the vowels for Hashem. Have you heard this, Eric? That they may have actually been saying not Adonai, but Hashem, which is the name in Hebrew. And there actually still is a strong tradition in Hebrew among Jewish communities. You don't say God, you say Hashem. If you're speaking in Aramaic, or if you're speaking in English, you say Hashem. So But you're absolutely right. When the Tetragrammaton is written, the pointing is changed so that you always read something else to avoid saying God's name. And that's that's why we use Lord, which has an unfortunate consequence of changing God's name into a title, which in some ways sort of depersonalizes in the interest of keeping sacrosanct in God's name. I couldn't even write the letter E. That's amazing. Other questions or observations about this? Can't see. Oh, sorry, Taylor.
I know you talked a lot about the way Messiah intends to use this as an educational device, and I
Yeah.
remember you brought it out in the Old Testament, which was really neat. But what other ways outside of courses
Yeah.
have you or the college used it or intend to?
Well, my hope was, to get local rabbis down, to have them look at it and begin a dialogue about the text there, and perhaps the possibility of creating some sort of joint efforts at educating the community, or sharing it with the community. I haven't done that yet. I'd love to see it. We talked a little early on, and shortly after we got the scroll, about a case. UCLA Heston College has it, at least then, presented in some sort of a glass case where people could see the text, see the scroll. But it sits in a closet in Murray, which is a safe place for it to be, but it seems a little unfortunate. Now, last night, Emerson Powery committed to raising money for a scriptorium on campus. So we're gonna see about setting aside this and a few other texts that we could. He talked about donating in the first edition of the Nestle Alama that he had. And I'm glad he's here. He can talk about that. We were brainstorming, brain dreaming, I guess, about what we could do, perhaps. Because it does seem unfortunate that it sits in a closet, and it is ours. We own it. It's a significant gift to have from donors, and it'd be nice to be able to use it in a really special way. I wish we knew more about it. I'd like to maybe get a student to do some research and just figure out how we can find out a little bit more about where it came from, what the provenance is. We can get a hold of that family that somehow came into possession of these 9 Torah scrolls. Well, part of me is a little nervous, you hear about that kind of thing. I just don't know if I want to find out about how those kinds of artifacts that are sacred to a community have been collected. It's a whole nother area of research, a whole nother topic for another day. But it bears witness to, a really unfortunate period in history when the Jews were forced to leave Russia. Other observations about the juxtaposition of these things, or the way we sort of think about our Bibles as texts wrapped in modern or ancient looking things?
I have a question.
Yeah, ma'am.
Every time I show my students the Codex Sinaiticus and look at it online,
Yeah.
and play around with it, someone always asks me, where's Exodus? Do you have any clue what happened to
No.
Exodus? Okay.
Because there isn't all of Genesis either. I mean, it's because Genesis 20-something, right? And Exodus is probably holding together some other book, and it just, and you know what I mean when they used old pieces of paper or parchment that they didn't think they would need anymore for the bindings of other books. So some scripts, some pieces have been found, a book falls apart, the binding, and you look, oh, there's an old part, and you pull it, oh, this is part of the Sinaiticus. Well, who would have put it in there in the first place, right? I mean, that's... So I don't know where Exodus is. Yeah, Joseph.
Eric, I'm wondering, in your own experience of reading the scroll form as opposed to the
Yeah.
codex form, do you find cognitively that you navigate the text in any different way?
No, I don't really spend a lot of time with this. It is a fun, Monday night, Mike Cosby was talking about the first time he really had an aha moment about the biblical text. It was when somebody put in front of him the Gospel of Mark typed with no verse or chapter breaks, and it was just a flow of the text. And it changed the way he saw the thing. And that's, there's no division in this, it just flows one thing into another. You look at the Sinaiticus and it's one word right into another, and it just has an entirely different feel. My first Bible had a verse, and there was a little paragraph marker at the beginning of that verse or at the end of the verse, I can't remember, and every verse was its own paragraph. It just invited atomistic, almost anti-contextual reading, where you can just pull things out. This is a whole different animal. And you have to sort of look around and find, where you are. And it's worn out, a lot of people talk about when Jesus, goes in front of the synagogue. Is it Luke 4? He finds the place where it says. And Emerson pointed out to me yesterday, he actually doesn't read it aloud. We don't know if he does, right? Is that what you're talking about? It's always a different feel for me when I'm reading in Hebrew than when I am in the English. Other observations, questions? Okay, yeah.
I was reading one of my classes, I forget which one, but it was saying how Christianity really were the people that took things from the schools and then started buying things into books. And that's where books became a little more prevalent, because it was easier to carry.
Yeah.
A whole bunch of different scrolls, you get book versus all this.
Right.
What are your feelings on that? Do you prefer scrolls over books?
Well, they are easier. I don't know the history of the Jewish book. I don't know at what point there's an effort to produce a Hebrew Bible for a Jewish community in book form. This is a Christian effort. The Codex Leningradensis is a Jewish effort. So there's, in 1000, there's a book that's the Jewish Bible. The canonical order is interesting in that one, and what place the books are in. But I don't know. Maybe one of the other folks here can speak to that. This is very ceremonial. In the ancient form of the book, of the scroll, prohibits any other reading than, I had to go in a special table to roll it out. It demands a kind of careful setup, and so by keeping it in this shape, they've almost, the community has preserved a way of caring for or viewing. And Christians have done that by using large books, Bibles with fancy covers and gilt pages and such. But I don't know enough about modern Jewish publishing of the Bible to know if they do the same kinds of really fancy, schmancy stuff that we do. There aren't as many translations produced by Jewish publishing houses as there are by Christian publishing houses. But I don't know about the actual, ornateness of the thing. Like, is there a Jewish version of the Turner and RSV? I don't know. But you're saying that the Christian community sort of pushed the Bible from that into book form, right? And that could be the case. If you need to go ahead and go. There's the Torah is special within the Hebrew Bible. The first 5 books they hold a special, they're bound together like this. You wouldn't see an entire Bible that is in one scroll, it'd be too big. So there's another thing, we don't separate out, we don't have the Gospels on one scroll and then the rest of so we have a whole different approach, I think, to conceiving of Scripture. maybe not entirely, but there are certain particular nuances within the Jewish community. This is the thing that is in the Ark. It's not the entire Jewish Bible, it's just this. And so, I mean, as I think about this, it would be interesting to look at how, as the Jewish process of canonization moves along, it wasn't wrapped up and tidy by the time Jesus was written. They had the Torah, they had the prophets, but they were still working out some of the details for the rest of the Old Testament. You know, how does the idea of a book factor into the canonization process? If you're using scrolls all the time, is there not as much of a need to close the canon, so to speak? You know, does this, you know, is it in or out? It's easier to think about in terms of a book than is it just in the pile with all the other ones? You know,